Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. I'm Cat, and this is Cat Has Questions. Picture this. It's the middle of July in the year 1518. The summer air hangs heavy over the narrow streets of Strasbourg, a city nestled along the Rhine River in what is now eastern France. The smell of livestock, smoke, and fresh bread drifts through the crowded marketplace. Merchants are arranging their stalls for the day, children weave between carts, and neighbors stop to exchange the same familiar greetings they've shared countless times before. At first, it seems like an ordinary morning, until someone notices a woman dancing. Not a celebration, not during a festival, not because musicians are playing nearby. She's simply dancing. She moves alone through the street with no music to guide her steps. There's no smile on her face, no laughter, no audience. Her movements aren't graceful or joyful. They're relentless, mechanical, as though her body has decided to move without asking permission from her mind. People stop what they're doing to watch. Some laugh, some stare. Others assume she simply had too much wine. Or perhaps she's trying to entertain a small crowd. But as the hours pass, something becomes deeply unsettling. She doesn't stop. Morning turns to afternoon. Afternoon fades into evening. Still, she dances. When darkness finally settles over the city, most people retreat to their homes, believing that surely by the morning, the strange spectacle will have ended. Instead, the woman is still dancing. According to historical accounts, she continues through the next day. Imagine what that must have looked like. Feet swollen and blistered, muscles cramping, breathing becoming more labored with every passing hour. The human body simply isn't designed to remain in constant motion for days. Eventually, exhaustion should win. But somehow it doesn't. Word spreads quickly throughout Strasbourg. Curious onlookers gather in growing numbers. Neighbors whisper to one another, trying to explain what they're seeing. Is she possessed? Has she gone mad? Is she being punished by God? Or is this some illness no one has ever witnessed before? No one seems to have an answer. Then something even stranger happens. Other people begin to dance. At first, it's just a few, then several more. Within days, the number grows into dozens. Soon, the streets of Strasbourg are filled with people who appear unable, or perhaps unwilling, to stop moving. Some reportedly dance until they collapse from exhaustion, only to rise again and continue. Others scream in pain while their bodies keep moving. Historical records even claim that some dancers eventually died, their hearts and bodies giving out after days of near continuous movement. It sounds impossible, like the plot of a horror film, or an urban legend that has grown more unbelievable with every retelling. But historians agree that something extraordinary happened in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518. What they can't agree on is why. Was it a mysterious illness? A poisonous fungus hidden in the local food supply? A religious curse? Mass psychological illness? Or could hundreds of otherwise ordinary people really have been swept into a phenomenon so powerful that their own minds overruled their bodies? More than 500 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. Today, we're diving into one of history's strangest unsolved mysteries. An event so bizarre that if it happened today, videos of it would dominate social media within minutes. Scientists from around the world would rush to investigate, and we'd all be asking the exact same question. How could hundreds of people suddenly become unable to stop dancing? Before we can begin to understand what happened in the streets of Strasbourg, we need to step back and understand the world these people lived in. Because if you're picturing a quaint medieval town where life was slow and simple, think again. Life in Europe during the early 1500s was incredibly difficult. Strasbourg, which today sits in northeastern France near the German border, was in 1518 a prosperous free city within the Roman Empire. It was a center for trade, religion, and craftsmanship. Merchants traveled through its streets, markets bustled with activity, and towering churches dominated the skyline. But beneath that appearance of prosperity, life for the average person was anything but easy. Most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation. Crop failures weren't just an inconvenience, they could determine whether an entire family survived the winter. Food shortages were common, and inflation meant even basic staples could become unaffordable. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving people more vulnerable to disease. And disease was everywhere. This was a world long before antibiotics, modern sanitation, or even an understanding of germs. A relatively minor infection could become life-threatening. Epidemics swept through cities with alarming regularity. And while the worst years of the Black Death were in the past, plague outbreaks still occurred often enough to keep fear close at hand. Medical knowledge was limited, and many illnesses that are easily treated today were mysterious, frightening, and very often fatal. Daily life also came with constant physical demands. Most people worked long hours doing manual labor. Farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and laborers depended entirely on their bodies to earn a living. There were no labor laws, no paid sick leave, and no social safety nets. If you couldn't work, you often couldn't eat. On top of those everyday struggles, the years leading up to 1518 had been especially difficult. Historians believe the region had experienced periods of poor harvests, rising food prices, and outbreaks of disease. Political instability and economic uncertainty only added to this strain. Families who had already endured years of hardship faced an uncertain future. And chronic stress became an unavoidable part of daily life. But perhaps the biggest difference between their world and ours wasn't the hardship itself. It was how they explained it. Today, if something strange happens, we turn to doctors, scientists, psychologists, or the internet in search of answers. The people of Strasbourg didn't have those resources. Their understanding of the world was deeply intertwined with religion, folklore, and the supernatural. If someone became seriously ill, many believed it could be a punishment from God. If crops failed, perhaps a saint had been angered. If an unexplained tragedy struck a community, it might be blamed on demons, curses, or unseen spiritual forces. These beliefs weren't fringe ideas. They were widely accepted explanations for events that no one could otherwise understand. One figure in particular would become closely associated with what happened that summer. His name was Saint Vitus. According to medieval tradition, Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr whose name became linked to a mysterious condition, sometimes referred to as Saint Vitus dance. People believed that those who offended the saint, or who were cursed in some way, could be compelled to dance uncontrollably. Today, historians recognize that the term Saint Vitus dance has been used over the centuries to describe several completely different conditions, including neurological disorders that we now know to have nothing to do with the events in Strasbourg. But in 1518, many people genuinely believed that supernatural forces could cause uncontrollable movement. To them, this wasn't superstition. It was reality. It's difficult for us to fully appreciate just how much those beliefs shaped the way people interpreted unusual events. If your neighbor suddenly began dancing without explanation, you probably wouldn't assume they were experiencing a curse. You might wonder if they were having a medical emergency, suffering from a neurological disorder, under the influence of drugs, or experiencing a psychiatric crisis. The people of Strasbourg didn't have those frameworks. They interpreted the world through the lens of faith, folklore, and divine intervention. And that difference matters. Because when something extraordinary began unfolding in July of 1518, the explanations people reached for, and the decisions they made because of those explanations, would shape the course of one of history's strangest mysteries. And it all began with a single woman. A woman history remembered by the name of Frau Traffe. If you've ever heard of the dancing plague of 1518, you've probably heard the name Frau Traffe. According to the historical accounts that have survived, it all began with her. The problem is, we know remarkably little about who she actually was. Even the name Frau may not have been her real name. Some historians believe it was simply the surname of her husband, while others question whether it was recorded accurately at all. Beyond that, history is almost completely silent. We don't know how old she was, we don't know what she looked like, if she had children. We don't know what she did for a living. In fact, nearly everything we know about her comes from documents written after the events unfolded, rather than from her own words. She left behind no diary or letter, no explanation, only a mystery. According to several contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, sometime in July of 1518, Frau stepped into the streets of Strasbourg and began to dance. One of the earliest surviving descriptions simply states that she, quote, began to dance, quote. That's it. No explanation, no music, no celebration. Just a woman who stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no festival taking place, no celebration, no musicians leading a procession through the street. At first, people likely assumed she would stop after a few minutes, then after an hour. Then perhaps she'd exhaust herself, but she didn't. Historical accounts suggest she continued for hours, then through the next day. Some reports claim she danced for several days, with only brief pauses brought on by complete physical exhaustion before beginning again. Imagine witnessing that. This wasn't someone enjoying music at a celebration. Her movements appeared involuntary, repetitive, relentless, and seemingly impossible to control. As more people noticed, crowds began to gather. Some watched out of curiosity, others out of concern. Some were probably frightened. Others may have believed they were witnessing a miracle or a curse. And here's where it's important to separate what history documents from what popular retellings have added. You've probably heard dramatic descriptions claiming Frau screamed while dancing, cried uncontrollably, begged for help, or danced until blood soaked through her shoes. These details certainly make for compelling storytelling. The problem is that historians can't verify most of them. The surviving records don't tell us what expression was on her face. They don't tell us whether she spoke. They don't even tell us if she wanted to stop. Those missing details have allowed centuries of writers, filmmakers, and internet articles to fill in the blanks with imagination. But the truth is, we simply don't know. What we do know is that something about her behavior captured the attention of the city. Local authorities became aware of the situation. Physicians observed her, religious leaders took notice. What began as one woman's inexplicable behavior was quickly becoming a public spectacle. If the story had ended there, it's unlikely any of us would have ever heard her name. One unexplained medical episode, even if it's a very unusual one, probably wouldn't have even earned a place in history. But within days, something happened that transformed a strange incident into one of history's greatest mysteries. Other people started dancing too, not because they wanted to perform or because someone taught them. According to historical records, they simply just joined in. At first, there was only a handful, and then dozens. Before long, the streets of Strasbourg were filled with people who appeared unable to stop moving. Whatever had begun with Frau Traffe no longer belonged to one woman. It had become something much, much bigger. So as the days passed, this isolated incident became more and more people dancing. At first, there were only a few. Maybe some neighbors, some curious onlookers. But what they do tell us is that the number continued to grow. Within about a week, contemporary accounts suggest there were several dozens of people dancing throughout Strasbourg. A surviving chronicle described how many of them continued in their dancing day and night. As the weeks went on, the number increased even further. This is where you'll often see one of the most repeated claims about the dancing plague, that nearly 400 people were dancing at the height of the outbreak. It's an astonishing number, but it's also one historians approach with some caution. This figure appears in several later historical accounts and has become widely accepted in popular retellings. Some historians believe the number was likely in the hundreds, while others argue it may have been smaller. Whatever the precise total, one thing is clear. This was no longer one woman's inexplicable behavior. It was a citywide crisis. Imagine walking through Strasbourg during those weeks. Instead of hearing merchants shouting prices or blacksmiths hammering iron, you would have seen groups of exhausted men and women moving almost endlessly through the streets. Some stumbled as they danced. Others reportedly collapsed from exhaustion before recovering enough to continue. Witnesses described people sweating heavily under the summer sun, their bodies visibly deteriorating as the days passed. Whether every dancer was truly incapable of stopping, or whether some felt psychologically compelled to continue, is something historians still debate. The city suddenly faced a problem no one knew how to solve. It wasn't an invading army, a plague caused by visible sores or fevers, it wasn't a fire, it wasn't famine. And there was one unsettling question. Was it spreading? Today, if several people in one community suddenly developed unexplained symptoms, public health officials would immediately begin asking whether an infectious disease was involved. But in 1518, people had no concept of viruses or bacteria. Instead, they searched for answers using the knowledge available to them. Some believed they were under a curse, others suspected demonic influence, and still others turned to the city's physicians for answers. Those physicians examined the dancers and reached a conclusion that sounded strange to modern ears. According to surviving records, the physicians concluded the dancers suffered from what they called hot blood. Rather than blaming demons or witchcraft, they believed an excess of heat within the body had triggered the uncontrollable movements. In medieval medicine, health was believed to depend on maintaining balance among the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of blood, or blood that had become overheated, was thought to cause a variety of physical and emotional ailments. Isn't that crazy that they thought there was four things that kept the body going? Just blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. That's crazy. To the physicians of Strasbourg, the dancers weren't necessarily possessed, nor did they believe the condition was contagious in the way we think of infectious diseases today. Instead, they just believed the body needed to rid itself of this extra heat. And that conclusion led city officials to make a decision that would become one of the most bizarre public health responses in recorded history. Instead of trying to stop the dancing, they decided the dancers should keep dancing. In fact, one account says the city council gave authority to physicians who prescribed that the afflicted should, quote, dance themselves free of it. According to prevailing medical theories of the time, the body just needed to work through this imbalance. To modern ears, this conclusion sounds almost absurd. If someone ran a marathon and collapsed from exhaustion, our instinct wouldn't be to tell them to keep running until they felt better. But in 1518, the physicians believed allowing the dancers to continue moving was the quickest path to recovery. So rather than stopping the dance, they encouraged it. According to several historical accounts, officials cleared public spaces to give the dancers room to move. Temporary wooden platforms were reportedly constructed so people could continue dancing more safely and with fewer obstructions. Musicians were hired, drummers were brought in. Professional dancers were even recruited to help keep the afflicted moving. Think about this for a minute. The city wasn't trying to suppress the outbreak, it was actively facilitating it. It's one of the most surreal images in all of recorded history. But here's something worth considering. They weren't ignoring science, they were following what they believed was science, and that's an important distinction. It's easy for us with centuries of medical advancements to laugh at this decision, but they don't know anything about bacteria, viruses, neurology, psychology. When every authority figure around you, including trained physicians, tells you that the body simply needs to expel excessive heat through movement, would you question them? Most people wouldn't. According to many accounts, the outbreaks only continued. The more the dancers danced, the weaker they became. Their bodies were pushed further and further beyond their physical limits. As concern grew, city leaders began to wonder if perhaps the physicians had been wrong. Maybe this wasn't a medical condition at all. Maybe it was something spiritual. Historical records suggest the city's strategy eventually shifted. Instead of encouraging continuous dancing, authorities began looking toward religion for answers. Many believed the afflicted had been cursed by Saint Vitus, who we talked about earlier, the 4th century Christian martyr whose name had long been associated with uncontrollable dancing. If medicine had failed, perhaps faith could succeed. Groups of dancers were reportedly transported to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Saverne, roughly 25 miles northwest of Strasbourg. There, according to historical accounts, they participated in religious rituals intended to break the curse. Some sources describe priests praying over them. Others mentioned the dancers being given small crosses or red shoes that had been blessed before taking part in ceremonies of repentance and healing. Whether those specific details occurred exactly as later accounts describe is difficult to verify. What historians generally agree on, though, is that the city's response shifted away from encouraging more dancing toward this religious intervention. And sometime after that, the outbreak gradually came to an end. No dramatic cure, no single breakthrough. The dancing simply faded away. But before it did, one question had begun to spread almost as quickly as the dancing itself. Had people actually died from this strange epidemic? Or had that part of the story grown larger with every retelling over the last 500 years? If you've heard of the dancing plague of 1518, you've probably heard the most shocking claim that people literally danced themselves to death. It's certainly the detail that has helped keep this story alive for more than 5 centuries. But is it actually true? Like so much of this mystery, the answer depends on how much confidence we're willing to place in historical records that are over 500 years old. Many modern articles and even some documentaries claim that at the height of the outbreak, as many as 15 people were dying every single day from nonstop dancing. It's an unforgettable statistic. There's just one problem. Historians have struggled to find contemporary evidence that clearly supports it. That number appears to have originated from later interpretations of historical documents rather than from a daily death record kept during the outbreak itself. While it's been repeated countless times over the years, many scholars caution that we simply can't verify it with certainty. That doesn't necessarily mean no one died. It means we should be careful about stating specific numbers as facts. So when you think about what this would actually do to the body, it's not difficult to imagine the potential consequence being death. Continuous physical exertion can lead to severe dehydration, dangerously elevated body temperatures, electrolyte imbalances, kidney damage, muscle breakdown, and cardiovascular collapse. Today, endurance athletes train for months before attending events that last a single day. Even then, marathon runners, ultra-marathon competitors, and endurance cyclists sometimes require emergency medical care. And the people of Strasbourg were not conditioned athletes. Many were already living with poor nutrition, chronic stress, and limited access to food and clean water. So if they truly danced for days with little rest, the physical toll would have been immense. So could someone have died under those circumstances? Absolutely. What remains uncertain is how often it actually happened during the outbreak. Some historians believe a number of deaths likely occurred, even if the exact figure has been lost to history. Others argue that later writers may have unintentionally exaggerated the mortality to make the story even more remarkable. It's also worth remembering that 16th century record-keeping was far from perfect. Deaths weren't always documented consistently. Causes of death were often uncertain. And many surviving records were written by observers trying to make sense of an event that defied explanation. For me, one of the most fascinating parts of this mystery isn't whether 15 people died each day. It's the fact that enough credible observers documented this event for historians to agree something extraordinary truly happened. This wasn't a folktale invented centuries later. City records exist, medical writings exist, chronicles written by people living around that time exist. In fact, historians have pieced together the story using everything from physician notes and cathedral sermons to local chronicles and even records issued by the Strasbourg City Council itself. Once we move beyond the sensational headlines and exaggerated statistics, we're left with a mystery that's arguably even more interesting. If this wasn't simply a bizarre legend, what could possibly explain it? For 500 years, historians, physicians, psychologists, and scientists have proposed answers. Some point to the mind, others point to food, others point to faith, and a few believe we may never know the truth at all. So let's investigate the theories. Theory 1 is mass psychogenic illness. If you ask most historians and psychologists today what they believe the cause of the dancing plague of 1518 was, you'll hear the same explanation come up again and again: mass psychogenic illness. Historian John Waller, who has extensively studied the dancing plague, argues that the strongest explanation is a form of mass psychogenic illness brought on by extreme stress and the cultural beliefs of that time. You may have heard it called mass hysteria, though many experts now prefer the term mass psychogenic illness because it's more accurate and avoids some of the outdated assumptions associated with the older phrase. For example, mass hysteria. Hysteria was always associated with women, so I'm sure that's part of the reason they don't use it anymore, because other people can be hysterical, not just women. At first glance, the idea can sound almost impossible. Can stress alone really cause dozens or even hundreds of people to develop the same bizarre symptoms? Surprisingly, history suggests the answer is yes. Mass psychogenic illness occurs when physical symptoms spread through a group of people without an identifiable infectious disease or environmental toxin. The symptoms are real. They're not faked, imagined, or exaggerated. The people experiencing them genuinely believe something is happening because to them, something is happening. The mind and body are far more connected than we often realize. Think about a time that you were incredibly anxious. Maybe your heart started racing, your palms became sweaty, you felt nauseated before giving a presentation. Perhaps your chest tightened so much that you wondered if something was seriously wrong. Those physical sensations weren't imaginary. Your brain created real, measurable changes throughout your body in response to stress. Now imagine taking that individual experience and placing it inside an entire community already living under extraordinary pressure. Remember what Strasbourg looked like in 1518. Years of failed harvests, food shortages, disease, poverty, constant fear. Many historians believe the people of Strasbourg were already living under such intense psychological strain that they had reached a breaking point. And then, one woman began dancing. If the community already believed that curses, saints, and supernatural forces could cause uncontrollable movement, it's possible her behavior became something much larger than an isolated event. Psychologists refer to this as a social contagion. Not a virus, not a bacteria, but behaviors, emotions, and beliefs spreading from one person to another. It may sound unfamiliar, but versions of social contagion happen all of the time. Think about contagious laughter. Someone begins laughing uncontrollably, and before long, everyone else is laughing too, even if they don't really know what started it. Yawning works in a very similar way. Reading about someone yawning may even make you yawn yourself. The human brain is remarkably good at unconsciously mirroring the people around us. Of course, laughter and yawning aren't quite the same as dancing for days, but history provides other examples of mass psychogenic illness that are equally startling. In 1962, in what is now Tanzania, a group of schoolgirls suddenly began laughing uncontrollably, and the laughter wasn't joyful. It became impossible for many of them to stop. Some episodes reportedly lasted for hours. Others continued on and off for days. The phenomenon spread to other schools and nearby communities, eventually affecting hundreds of people and forcing several schools to temporarily close. Doctors searched for an infectious disease, but none were ever identified. Today, that event is widely considered one of the best documented cases of mass psychogenic illness. And remember, this was the 1960s, so this was not like centuries and centuries ago. There have been other events of this type of mass psychogenic illness. So communities where groups of people suddenly develop unexplained fainting spells, factories where workers reported mysterious illnesses despite no detectable chemical exposures, schools where students experience identical physical symptoms that medical investigations could never fully explain. Again and again, researchers have found that extreme stress, fear, expectation, and social influence can produce genuine physical symptoms in a surprisingly large group of people. So could something have happened similar in Strasbourg? Supporters of this theory think so. They argue that Frau Treffe may have experienced an individual psychological or neurological crisis. Once others witnessed her behavior through their own cultural lens of curses and Saint Vitus, and their own expectations and fears could have triggered similar symptoms. This explanation doesn't require an unknown disease or poisoned food, and it helps explain why the outbreak eventually just faded away rather than continuing indefinitely. But while this theory is the leading explanation today, it's not perfect. One major question remains. Could psychological stress alone really compel people to dance for days until they collapse from exhaustion? Some researchers think that that's asking too much of the human body. Others point out that historical records are incomplete, making it difficult to know exactly how continuous the dancing really was. If the reports are completely accurate, the mystery becomes considerably harder to explain. Which brings us to another theory, one that shifts the focus away from the human mind and onto something much smaller, a fungus that may have been hiding in the region's bread. For many years, one explanation seemed almost too perfect. Maybe the people of Strasbourg weren't experiencing a psychological phenomenon at all. Maybe they had been poisoned. The culprit? A fungus called ergot. Now, I had to look up what this was because I did not know what ergot was. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grains, particularly rye, which was a staple food throughout much of medieval Europe. Under the right conditions, the fungus produces toxic compounds known as ergot alkaloids. If that sounds vaguely familiar, which it doesn't, there's a reason. Centuries later, scientists studying these compounds developed substances chemically related to them, including the drug LSD. While ergot itself isn't LSD, the connection has helped fuel speculation that the people of Strasbourg may have been experiencing hallucinations or altered states of consciousness after eating contaminated bread. At first glance, it sounds like an excellent explanation. They're just on LSD, guys. If an entire community consumed grain contaminated with ergot, perhaps they all became intoxicated at the same time. Mystery solved. Ergot poisoning is a very real medical condition. Historically, outbreaks have caused devastating illness across Europe. People who consumed contaminated grains sometimes experience burning sensations in their hands and feet so severe that the condition became known as Saint Anthony's fire. Others developed muscle spasms, convulsions, confusion, hallucination. In several cases, reduced blood flow caused fingers, toes, and even entire limbs to die from lack of circulation. So it's easy to understand why researchers became interested in this possibility. During a time when nearly everyone relied on rye, it seemed to fit. But as historians and medical researchers took a closer look, problems began to appear. The first issue is the symptoms themselves. While ergot poisoning can certainly produce muscle spasms and involuntary movements, it doesn't typically cause people to perform coordinated activities like dancing continuously for days. Instead, victims often experience painful muscle contractions, tremors, seizures, confusion, and significant physical weakness. Many become too sick to stand, not energetic enough to dance. Ergot poisoning usually also affects everyone who consumes the grain. If an entire town food supply had been contaminated, historians expect to see a much broader range of symptoms throughout the population. There likely would have been a more widespread illness. Timing also raises questions. The dancing outbreak appears to have spread gradually over days and weeks. Food poisoning, on the other hand, generally affects people very quickly. Ergot poisoning is usually profoundly debilitating. So it doesn't mean it played no role in this situation, because science is rarely that simple. But today, most historians and medical experts no longer view ergot poisoning as the leading explanation for the dancing plague, but it is still an intriguing possibility. So if psychology doesn't answer every question, and poisoned bread doesn't seem to explain the outbreak either, what else do we look at? For the people of Strasbourg, the answer wasn't found in medicine. It was found in faith, and in the belief that one saint held the power to make people dance. So theory 3 is kind of circling back to Saint Vitus. For the people of Strasbourg, supernatural and natural, there was really no distinction between that. Unexplained illnesses could sometimes be a message from God. One of the saints that most closely associated with this mysterious movement disorder was Saint Vitus. Vitus was a martyr, and over time, legends surrounding him grew. And by the Middle Ages, many Europeans believed he possessed the power to either protect people from or afflict them with uncontrollable dancing and convulsive movements. Pilgrims traveled to shrines dedicated to him, seeking healing from strange neurological symptoms. Parents prayed to him on behalf of sick children. His name became so closely connected to involuntary movement that several conditions were collectively referred to as Saint Vitus's dance, like we talked about before. So a lot of people think that he could have possibly cursed this community, and there's a lot of good reason to think that the people in Strasbourg in 1518 did. When people saw the dancing uncontrollably, many naturally reached for the explanation that made the most sense within their worldview: a curse, a saint's displeasure, divine punishment. If enough people genuinely expected a supernatural force to manifest this way, Could those expectations themselves influence behavior? Modern psychology suggests they can. Researchers have long studied something known as the nocebo effect. So most people are familiar with the placebo effect, which is the phenomenon in which positive expectations can produce measurable improvements. But the nocebo effect, which I've never heard of that, and it's kind of fun. The nocebo effect is essentially the opposite. It's negative expectations that can produce real physical symptoms. So if someone sincerely believes they're being exposed to something harmful, they may experience pain, nausea, dizziness, weakness, or other symptoms even when no physical danger exists. So if someone believed they had fallen under the curse of Saint Vitus, their body might begin responding in ways they genuinely couldn't control. And then others witness it, they recognize the sign, and they're kind of fearing the curse. And suddenly the cycle keeps reinforcing itself and repeating itself. Because belief is fueling the behavior, and the behavior is reinforcing the belief. It's important to emphasize that this doesn't require people to be pretending or just joining in for fun. It's literally like a psychological distress that turns into physical distress. Still, even together, these theories don't answer every question. Why did the outbreak happen in Strasbourg and not somewhere else? Why during the summer of 1518? And why has no event on this scale ever been documented again? Perhaps the true explanation isn't one single theory at all. Perhaps it's far more complicated. The more historians have caused it, so this is kind of the fourth and final theory, which it's not really a theory in its own. It's basically a mixture of things. So the more historians have studied the dancing plague of 1518, the more many of them have begun to think we may be asking the wrong question. Instead of searching for the cause, perhaps we should be asking about the combination of causes. So it's a city where people have endured years of failed harvests, food is scarce, disease is common. There's a culture where supernatural isn't viewed as a fantasy, but it's accepted as everyday life. Then one woman begins behaving in a way no one can explain. And then everyone starts talking about it. Rumors spread, fear grows. Every conversation reinforces the idea that something extraordinary is happening. Could all of those things together create conditions unlike anything we'd normally experience? Many historians think the answer is yes. Rather than imagining one mysterious trigger, they see the dancing plague as a perfect storm. Psychological stress, social contagion, religious expectation, physical exhaustion, and malnutrition. So one of the first questions I had while researching the episode was, has anything like this ever happened before? And so this wasn't actually the first documented outbreak of what historians call dancing mania. And it wasn't even the largest. In fact, similar events were reported across parts of Europe between the 13th and 17th centuries, particularly in communities along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. One of the earliest well-documented outbreaks occurred in 1237 in Erfurt, where chronicles described a large group of children dancing and jumping for miles before collapsing from exhaustion. And then in 1374, there was people in Aachen, I hope I'm saying that right, suddenly began dancing uncontrollably, and it spread to other cities. And then in southern Italy, another related phenomenon emerged known as tarantism. So what this means, this is kind of interesting and kind of, I guess, could be another theory as to the dancing plague in 1518. For centuries, people believed that a bite of a tarantula spider could cause victims to become restless, ill, and compelled to dance. Music was actually considered the cure, with musicians playing for hours while the afflicted danced in hopes of sweating out the poison. Today, historians generally don't believe spider venom explains these events, but many think tarantism may represent another form of culturally influenced mass psychogenic illness. By the 17th century, when this occurred in 1518, large-scale dancing manias had become exceedingly rare, and nothing quite like the Strasbourg has ever been documented on that scale again. That doesn't mean mass psychogenic illness has disappeared, like we talked about. That was as most recent as the 1960s with the laughing hysteria. So it's far from it that mass psychogenic illness has gone away. Instead, it just seems to have changed with society. More than 500 years later, the streets of Strasbourg no longer echo with the footsteps of exhausted dancers. The wooden stages are gone, The physicians who prescribed more dancing have long since become a curious footnote in medical history. And the people who lived through those bewildering weeks have been gone for centuries. Yet somehow their story lives on. Not because we know exactly what happened, but because we don't. The dancing plague has fascinated historians, physicians, psychologists, and curious minds for generations because it refuses to fit neatly into a single category. It's not purely a medical mystery, it's not purely psychological, it's not religious, it's a human mystery. One that reminds us how deeply connected our minds, bodies, beliefs, and communities really are. As much as we'd like to think we're completely different from the people who lived in 1518, perhaps we're not as different as we imagined. We still look for explanations when something frightening happens. We still influence one another in ways we don't always recognize. But human nature hasn't changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe. Every generation has its own mysteries, its own blind spots, its own explanations that future generations may one day look back on with confusion. Maybe that's why the dancing plague continues to resonate after all this time. Not because it gives us answers, because it reminds us of how many questions remain. We'll probably never know for certain what happened that day, and perhaps that's okay. Some mysteries aren't valuable because they're solved. They're valuable because they force us to think differently, to question our assumptions, to recognize that the past was every bit as complicated as the present. As always, I'd love to hear what you think. After hearing all the evidence, which explanation makes the most sense to you? Do you think the dancing plague can be explained psychologically alone? Or do you believe historians are still missing something important? If you enjoyed today's episode of Cat Has Questions, I'd be so grateful if you'd follow the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. If there's a mystery, historical event, true crime case, or unexplained phenomenon you'd like me to cover in a future episode, please reach out to me via social media or email. I love hearing your suggestions, and many of my episodes start with ideas from listeners just like you. Until next time, stay curious. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.